So we have been learning about the preterite tense, which is a tense which enables us to talk about the past. Now, when we learned the present tense, we learned about irregular verbs. However, we learned that irregular verbs followed no particular pattern and that we just simply had to kind of memorize them in order to know them. Each present tense irregular verb was different from the others. Now, in the irregular preterites, this is not always true. In the irregular preterites, there is a kind of system and pattern that they follow. So that's kind of the good news. The good news is that there's a pattern that you can learn that all the irregular preterites will follow. The bad news is that the pattern is a little complicated. So what we're going to do is we're first going to look at the different components of the irregular preterite, and then we're going to kind of look at some examples on how we would put them together. Now, the first thing to note about the irregular preterite is that it will actually use different endings than the other three categories of the preterite. Thus far, we have learned, right, that if I wanted to talk in the preterite, that I would use these particular categories of endings, right? Certain ones for AR and certain ones for ER and IR. And then I would use those regardless of the category. If I'm in the regular, or if I'm in the irregular in yo, or the irregular stem changing, I'm going to still use those exact same endings because those endings tell me where I am in time and who is speaking in the situation that I'm talking about. Now, as far as the irregular preterites are concerned, they will all use the same ending, regardless of whether they end in ER or whether they end in IR. However, those endings are slightly different from the ones that we used before. Let's look at them together so that we can kind of begin to grasp a little bit how they're different. The endings for the irregular preterite is as follows: y, iste, o, imos, isteis, yeron. Now, they may look kind of familiar, and that is because they are basically a mashup of the AR preterites and the ER and IR preterites that you learned before. Now, you may notice also there are no accent marks on any of these, and that is because they do not require an accent mark. So in the irregular preterites, there are two things that are interesting about them. The first is that the endings are different, but they are basically a mixture of the endings that you learned before. The second is that they don't require any accent marks. Now, what's tricky about them is that not only does the ending change, but also the root will change when using these verbs. For example, estar will completely change in the root to become estuve. Tener will completely change in the root to become tuv. And querer will become quis, etc., etc. These are examples of the verbs that fall into this category and how their stems would change based on using them in the irregular preterite. So how would we kind of put that together? That's the question that we want to ask ourselves. How would we take this stem and put the endings over here? And it feels very confusing. So let's look at a sample verb to just kind of get an idea on how we would put them together. So here we see, right, we have the verb querer, and we've conjugated it in the preterite, and because it's an irregular preterite, we've used all the irregular preterite endings that are listed right here, and we've also changed it in the stem, right? So querer, which the stem would become quis, would become yo quise, tú quisiste, él quiso, nosotros quisimos, vosotros quisisteis, ellos quisieron, without accent marks. And that's what you would do for all of the verbs that are irregular in the preterite, with the exception of ser and ir, which follow the same verb pattern, and you can find that in your book on page 222. Now, let's think then about how we might do this if we actually had a sample. So let's say I'm talking with my really good friend Isabella, and I want to tell her about how great my vacation was that I took last year. Well, I want to tell her I had a great time, and I want to tell her that I was able to totally relax. So I need to be able to use the preterite to talk about that in the past. Unfortunately, both of those sentences would require irregular preterites. So now I need to think, okay, well, how would I say that using an irregular preterite? Well, the first thing that I want to do whenever I think about conjugating these is I want to change the root. So if we take the first example, we don't just want to say yo ten, we don't want to write that down. We want to change the root of this to what it would become in the irregular preterite. So I will write down TUV because that's what the stem will change to. Then next, I want to think, okay, what ending would I use based on the new list of endings that I've given that are only for irregular preterites? How would I do that? Well, I know that yo, based on my personal pronoun usage, right? And for any more information on that, you can see the video on personal pronouns. I know based on my personal pronouns that this is going to fall into the category of first person singular. So I would take this ending right here and I would just tack it on. So it is important to remember, first I'm going to change the stem, then I'm going to find the ending, then I can put them together. But the second one, I would do the same thing, right? I would first realize, okay, this is an irregular preterite, so I need to change the stem. So I would pick out how the stem changes, and I would write that down. So I know that poder is going to become pud in the past tense. So then I need to go up here and find my ending, and I remember that it is a first person singular, so I'm going to have an E, and then I can put it there. Now, if I'm having a conversation with my friend Isabella, I can turn to her and say, yo tuve un buen tiempo, yo pude relajar mucho. And I'm telling her about how much I was able to enjoy my vacation, and I'm using the preterite to talk about the past. All right, now that we have learned how to use irregular preterites, what I would like for you to do is take one form of the irregular preterite that can be found in your textbook and conjugate it on the front of a note card. So for example, I conjugated estar in the preterite, and then on the back, I would like for you to use that same verb in the context of a sentence. For example, tú estuviste en Canadá el año pasado. Right? And then when you get into class, just pop it on the corkboard and I'll check it whenever I get a chance. And as always, right, be prepared to share in case I decide to call on you. Thanks, and I will see you in class.